All right, now let's talk about 500.7 or access privileges and management. So again, after doing your risk assessment, you need to make sure that your access privileges and management should perform the following functions. So first, limit user access privileges to only or to information systems that provide access to non-public information to only those necessary to perform the user's job. So we talked about the principle of list privileges, and you do not give access to the user if that user does not need it. And then next, limit the number of privileged accounts and limit the access functions of privileged accounts to only those necessary to perform the user's job. Again, privileged accounts can perform a lot of things. They might have administrative access. They may have a lot of permissions, like edit or delete permissions besides the read and write permissions. So you need to make sure that you limit the number of privileged accounts. So that means that you do not give all employees privileged accounts or admin accounts, and those with privileged accounts, you need to limit the access functions to only those necessary to perform the job. So next, limit the use of privileged accounts to only when performing functions requiring the use of such access. So some organizations are implementing just-in-time access, or JIT, and that means that you only give access when access is needed. So this can be a little tricky because a lot would argue that it is a waste of time to request access and wait for the approval time before you can actually use the privileged accounts to perform elevated functions, as opposed to just keeping the account and access available for use all the time. So I can totally understand the sentiment, but there are tools that can help you with this as well. So that those privileged accounts that are needed can be used only when they're needed without wasting too much time waiting for the approval and for requesting, of course. So it is something that organizations should look into because, again, it can save the personnel a lot of work and at the same time be compliant with the regulation. And then periodically and at a minimum annually review all those user access privileges and remove or disable accounts and access that are no longer necessary. So user accounts and user access reviews should be done on a regular basis. And if the organization can do it quarterly, then of course that would be great. But per regulation, the minimum is annually. So most organizations are doing it on a more frequent basis. And but if you don't have the manpower to do that, do it at least on an annual basis to satisfy the regulation. And it is very important because there may be some accounts that are still active, although the employees are not with the company anymore. And if those accounts are left unmanaged or unmanaged, attackers can use those accounts to get into your network and eventually your systems. And that said, it's very, very important that we maintain inventory of those accounts and the access associated with the accounts. And we need to perform reviews so that we know what accounts are needed and what accounts are dormant accounts, and that they can be disabled because they are no longer necessary. And then 5, disable or securely configure all protocols that permit remote control of devices. And there are protocols that are used to remotely control devices, and a lot of times admins would use those protocols because they need to access devices remotely. But again, they have to be configured securely. Now, if there are protocols that permit remote control of devices that you don't need, and after risk assessments and reviews, it's determined that those protocols are not needed anymore, then just disable those. So you also call that hardening, and that is a security practice. So again, disable remote access protocols or configure them securely. And then 6, we have to promptly terminate access following departures. So it makes sense, because if you have employees leaving the company, you have to make sure that you terminate the access right away, especially if it is an involuntary departure or termination. You have to make sure that you disable the access even hours before the termination, because that employee may be disgruntled and can do some damage if planning to retaliate, especially if that employee has a privileged access. But if it is, for example, departure or termination because of retirement, then maybe that employee is not a threat, and you can be more flexible on that. So as a best practice, accounts or accesses need to be disabled within 24 hours and not be based on the convenience of the administrator. So also, it is the same when an employee transfers from one division to another, because then there might be access that that employee won't need when he or she transfers to another department. So make sure that you review the access and determine if they still need those access based on their new job role. And then we have, to the extent passwords are employed as a method of authentication, the covered entity shall implement a written password policy that meets industry standards. So let's take standards from NIST, for example. So what does NIST say about strong passwords or passphrases? So if you are required to comply with PCI, what does PCI say about your strong passwords? So what if your password is used along with the MFA? And if you don't have multi-factor authentication employed within your environment, then what would your password requirements be? So you need to include those in the policy. You have to make sure that you use password complexity, whether that includes lowercase or uppercase letters or numbers or special characters, or do you implement passphrases? So just remember that a good password would be something that is hard to guess but easy for you to remember. And then we have Class A company. So a company shall monitor privileged access activity and shall implement a privileged access management solution. Again, that is going to be expensive, so just make sure that you know that you are a Class A company, because if you are not a Class A company, then Part C won't apply to you. So again, if you are a Class A company, then you have to have a privileged access management solution or PAM solution. It is not going to be you who will implement the solution hands-on. It will be somebody from your team, and if they are not aware of this section, then you have to make sure that you bring this up so that your organization can be compliant with this part of the regulation. And then you have here an automated method of blocking commonly used passwords. So this is also for Class A companies. Your organization needs to have a mechanism to block commonly used passwords, such as a password or password1 or flowers1 or let me in. So those kinds of commonly used passwords. So actually, if you Google commonly used passwords, it will give you a list of commonly used passwords, and attackers use those all the time. So attackers may have a username or an email address, and they use those commonly used passwords to access an account. And your tool should be able to block all those commonly used passwords so that your users won't use them as their passwords. All right, that would be it for now, and I will see you in the next video.